The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Matthews' well-kept front lawn as he slowly rocked in his favorite porch swing. At 93 years old, his movements were careful but purposeful, much like everything else in his life. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, gently held the steaming cup of black coffee, the same brand he'd been drinking since 1946. Every morning, Harold followed the same routine he'd maintained for the past 30 years. He would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., put on his navy blue robe over his plaid pajamas, and shuffle to his front porch to watch the neighborhood come to life. His neighbors had grown used to seeing the old veteran there, a peaceful guardian of their quiet suburban street. The small house Harold lived in wasn't fancy, but it held 70 years of memories. He bought it with his late wife Martha using his veteran's benefits after returning from World War II. The white paint might have been a bit faded now, but the American flag that hung by the door was always crisp and clean, replaced every year on Memorial Day without fail. In his front yard, Harold maintained a garden that was the pride of the neighborhood. Rows of bright red tomatoes grew alongside neat lines of green beans and carrots. But his real treasure was the collection of roses he'd started with Martha all those years ago. Each morning, after his coffee, he would tend to these flowers with the same dedication he'd once shown to his military duties. The neighbors all knew Harold's schedule by heart. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door would often bring him fresh-baked cookies on Wednesdays, while Tom Baker's kids would stop by after school to hear stories about the war, though Harold usually preferred to tell them about his adventures as a high school baseball player instead. He believed some memories were better left in the past. Inside his home, Harold kept things simple but orderly. His military training was still evident in the way he made his bed with hospital corners each morning, and how his shoes were always polished and lined up perfectly in his closet. On his living room wall hung his proudly displayed service medals, including a Purple Heart that he'd earned during a fierce battle in the Pacific. Below them sat an old footlocker, rarely opened but carefully maintained, containing memories from his time in the Marines. Harold's quiet life was filled with small pleasures. He enjoyed watching the birds that visited his bird bath, marking their different species in a small notebook he kept by his porch chair. The mailman, Jerry, would often stop for a quick chat about the weather or the local baseball team's performance. Even the neighborhood cats seemed to know Harold, often sleeping in the sunny spots of his porch while he read his morning newspaper. Despite living alone, Harold never felt lonely. His daughter Sarah called him every Sunday evening from Seattle, and his grandson Mike would video chat with him twice a month to show off his college achievements. Harold had even learned to use a smartphone, though he still preferred his old landline phone for most calls. The neighborhood children saw him as a friendly grandfather figure, often waving to him as they rode their bikes past his house. He kept a small bowl of hard candies by his front door, just like Martha used to do, for any young visitors who might stop by. Parents felt safe letting their kids visit Mr. Matthews, knowing he kept a watchful eye on the street. As spring turned to summer that year, Harold had no way of knowing that his peaceful routine was about to be disrupted. The old warehouse across the street, which had stood empty for nearly a decade, was about to get new owners. The for sale sign had come down last week, and there were rumors about who had bought it. Harold wasn't one to worry about changes. He'd seen plenty in his 9 decades. But something about the increased traffic of motorcycles passing by his house in recent days made him uneasy. Still, on this particular morning, Harold sat in his porch swing, sipping his coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. His roses were blooming particularly well this year, and he had plans to share some cuttings with Mrs. Rodriguez. Everything seemed peaceful, just as it had been for the past 30 years. But sometimes, the quietest moments come right before the storm. The peace of Harold's neighborhood shattered on a warm Tuesday afternoon. A convoy of loud motorcycles roared down the street, their engines echoing off the houses like thunder. Harold watched from his porch as 12 motorcycles pulled into the old warehouse parking lot across the street. The riders wore black leather jackets with a logo showing a red skull surrounded by chains. The bikers wasted no time. Within days, they had painted their club's name, Death's Door MC, in huge red letters across the warehouse wall. The sound of power tools and hammering filled the air as they renovated the building. Harold tried to stay positive, remembering what his late wife Martha always said about giving people a chance, but his military instincts told him trouble was coming. The first week wasn't too bad. Harold continued his morning routine, though the peaceful silence he once enjoyed was now broken by the constant coming and going of motorcycles. Some of the younger neighbors seemed excited about the change, calling it urban development. But Harold noticed how the mothers no longer let their children play freely in the front yards. Everything changed on Friday night. The bikers threw their first party. The warehouse windows glowed with colored lights, and music so loud it made Harold's windows rattle. His hearing aids picked up every bass beat, sending sharp pains through his head. The war had left him with sensitive hearing, and the noise brought back memories he'd rather forget. Around midnight, Harold put on his old blue cardigan and walked across the street. He moved slowly but stood straight, his military bearing still visible after all these years. 5 bikers stood smoking near the entrance, their leather vests covered in patches Harold didn't understand. He cleared his throat politely. "Evening, gentlemen," Harold said in his calm, steady voice. "I'm Harold Matthews from across the street. I was hoping we could talk about the noise level. You see, many of us are early sleepers, and my hearing aids are quite sensitive." The biggest biker, a man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his neck, stepped forward. His name patch read Crusher. He looked down at Harold and blew smoke in his direction. Well, looks like Grandpa's past his bedtime," he sneered, causing the others to laugh. Harold stood his ground. "I'm just asking for a bit of consideration. During the war." "During the war?" Another biker interrupted, revving his motorcycle's engine. "Hey boys, the old-timer wants to tell us war stories." The engine's roar drowned out Harold's words, and the group burst into cruel laughter. Over the next few days, things got worse. Whenever Harold sat on his porch, bikers would deliberately rev their engines while passing his house. They started parking their motorcycles directly across from his garden, leaving oil stains on the street. Empty beer cans appeared in his rose bushes every morning. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped bringing cookies on Wednesdays, too scared to walk past the warehouse. The neighborhood children no longer visited to hear Harold's stories. Even Jerry, the mailman, started delivering Harold's mail as quickly as possible, no longer stopping for their usual friendly chats. One night, Harold struggled to sleep as the party across the street raged on. His hands shook as he tried to adjust his hearing aids, and memories of explosions from the war mixed with the thundering music. His phone calls to the local police brought no help. "Sorry, Mr. Matthews," they would say, "but they're not technically breaking any laws." The final straw came when Harold found his prized roses trampled one morning. Tire tracks ran through his garden, destroying the flowers he and Martha had planted together decades ago. As he stood there, staring at the damaged plants, 3 bikers drove by slowly, revving their engines and laughing. Inside his house, Harold sat in his old armchair, looking at the medals on his wall. His purple heart caught the morning light, reminding him of times when he had faced much worse than a group of disrespectful bikers. But this was different. Back then, he had his fellow Marines beside him. Now, at 93, he felt alone and vulnerable for the first time in years. As another motorcycle roared past his house, Harold's hands gripped his armchair tightly. The peaceful life he had built over 30 years was crumbling around him. Something had to be done. What could one elderly veteran do against a group of hostile bikers? The answer would come to him soon enough, but for now, Harold Matthews, decorated war hero and respected neighbor, felt like a prisoner in his own home. The situation at Harold's house grew worse with each passing day. The bikers had turned their harassment into a cruel game, seeing how far they could push the elderly veteran before he broke. Every morning, Harold would find new damage to his property, each incident more distressing than the last. On Monday, they knocked over his mailbox. Harold spent 2 hours in the hot sun trying to fix it, his arthritic hands struggling with the tools while bikers circled the block, their laughter mixing with the roar of their engines. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her window, wanting to help but too frightened to come outside. Tuesday brought a new form of torment. The bikers began parking their motorcycles in front of Harold's house, creating an intimidating wall of chrome and steel. The machines leaked oil onto the street, leaving dark stains that reminded Harold of the blood spots he'd seen in the Pacific. When he tried to clean the stains, 3 bikers sat on their bikes watching him, revving their engines every time he got close to the curb. By Wednesday, Harold noticed his newspaper was missing. He caught a glimpse of Crusher, the lead biker, using pages from it to clean his motorcycle's chain. When their eyes met, Crusher smiled and slowly ripped another page, letting it blow across Harold's lawn. The old veteran's hands trembled, not from fear, but from a rage he hadn't felt since 1945. The police finally showed up on Thursday, but only because another neighbor called about the noise. Officer Jenkins, a young policeman who looked barely old enough to shave, spoke to the bikers briefly. Harold watched from his window as the officer laughed at something Crusher said, then drove away without even crossing the street to check on the elderly resident. "Just a neighborhood dispute," Harold overheard Officer Jenkins telling dispatch on his radio. "Nothing we can do about it." That night, Harold couldn't sleep. The bikers had their music blasting again, and the bass made his windows rattle. He sat in his living room, staring at his service medals on the wall. The Purple Heart seemed to mock him now. What good was bravery in war if he couldn't even protect his own home in peacetime? Friday brought the worst incident yet. Harold was trying to salvage what remained of his garden when he heard engines revving louder than usual. 6 bikers circled his house on their motorcycles, moving closer with each pass. The noise was deafening, and the exhaust fumes made him cough. One rider came so close to the sidewalk that Harold had to stumble backward to avoid being hit. Tom Baker, watching from next door, finally worked up the courage to step outside. "Leave him alone," he shouted. "He's a war hero." The bikers just laughed. Crusher pulled up to Tom's driveway. "War hero? Look at him now. Just a weak old man who needs his neighbors to fight his battles." Harold straightened his back, summoning the dignity that had carried him through 3 major battles in World War II. "I fought for your right to be free," he said quietly, "not for your right to bully others." "Oh, did you hear that, boys?" Crusher mockingly called to his gang. "Grandpa thinks he's still a tough guy." He gunned his engine, the noise making Harold's hearing aids screech painfully. "Your war's over, old man. This is our territory now." That evening, Harold found a note pushed under his door. In crude handwriting, it read, "Time to move out, old-timer." Before something bad happens, the threat was clear, and for the first time since the war, Harold felt truly afraid. He sat in his favorite armchair as darkness fell, watching the bikers party across the street. Through his window, he could see them pointing at his house and laughing. Some made shooting gestures with their fingers. The message was clear: they weren't going to stop until he was gone. In his 93 years, Harold had faced death on the beaches of the Pacific, lost his beloved Martha to cancer, and learned to live alone. But this was different. This wasn't a fair fight. This was bullying, pure and simple, and it was affecting not just him but the whole neighborhood. As midnight approached, Harold watched another group of bikers circle his house, their headlights casting menacing shadows on his walls. He knew he had to do something. But what could one old veteran do against a gang of violent bikers? The answer lay in his old footlocker, but not in the way the bikers might expect. Harold Matthews was about to remind them that old Marines never really retire. They just regroup and adapt. Saturday morning arrived with an unusual silence. Harold sat in his living room, his breakfast untouched on the side table. His hands rested on his knees as he stared at the American flag hanging outside his window, the same flag that had flown there for decades. Something about its quiet fluttering in the morning breeze brought tears to his tired eyes. The day had started like any other, with Harold waking up at his usual time of 6:00 a.m. But when he stepped onto his porch, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The morning air carried a strange smell of spray paint. His heart sank as he walked to the front of his house. There, sprayed across his white picket fence in ugly red letters, were the words, "Leave or else, old man." The paint was still wet, dripping like blood down the wooden slats that he and Martha had painted together so many summers ago. But that wasn't what broke Harold's heart. What made his hands shake with anger was what they had done to his flag. His American flag, the symbol he had fought for, the flag under which he had watched friends die, hung in tatters. Someone had taken a knife to it, slashing it into ribbons. Beer cans littered his front yard, and one of the bikers had used his flagpole as a makeshift ashtray, stuffing cigarette butts into the holder. Harold stood there for a long moment, his back straight despite his years. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek as he carefully lowered what remained of the flag. In all his years of service, through all the horrors of war, he had never let the flag touch the ground. Even now, with his hands shaking and his heart breaking, he folded the tattered remains with military precision. Inside his house, Harold placed the ruined flag on his coffee table. His eyes moved from the flag to his wall of medals, then to the old footlocker in the corner. That footlocker hadn't been opened in years. It contained memories, some good, some terrible, from his time in the Marine Corps. Slowly, every movement deliberate, Harold walked to the footlocker. His knees creaked as he knelt beside it. The brass lock was tarnished but still functional. When it clicked open, the sound echoed in the quiet room like a gunshot. Inside, beneath his old uniform and a stack of yellowed letters from Martha, lay a small black address book. Its leather cover was worn smooth by time, the pages yellow with age. Harold lifted it carefully, as if handling a priceless artifact. In many ways it was. This wasn't just any address book. It contained the phone numbers and addresses of every surviving member of his old Marine unit, plus contacts for dozens of other veterans he'd met over the years. Some of the entries were marked with small crosses, those who had passed on, but many were still there, still living, still part of the Brotherhood. Harold's hands trembled as he opened the book. He hadn't called any of these numbers in years. Many might not even be working anymore. But as he stared at the names, memories flooded back. Faces of young men who had fought beside him, voices that had encouraged him through the darkest days of the war, hands that had pulled him to safety when he was wounded. A sudden roar of motorcycles outside made his hearing aids whistle. Through his window, he could see 3 bikers circling his house again, probably admiring their handiwork with the flag and fence. Their laughter drifted through the walls, but Harold barely heard it. His focus was entirely on the small black book in his hands. Martha had always told him that pride was a sin, but there were times when a man had to stand up for what was right. Harold had been a Marine, and Marines lived by a code. Part of that code was never leaving a brother behind. Another part was standing up to bullies. With newfound resolve, Harold stood up and walked to his telephone. His arthritis made dialing difficult, but he managed. As he listened to the ringing on the other end, he looked at the tattered flag on his coffee table. For the first time in weeks, a small smile crossed his face. The bikers thought they were dealing with one old veteran. They were about to learn a very important lesson about the meaning of brotherhood. Harold Matthews might be 93, but he was about to remind them that some bonds never break, and some debts are always honored. The old rotary phone felt warm in Harold's hand as he dialed the first number from his address book. His finger trembled slightly as he carefully turned the dial 7 times. The ringing sound seemed to last forever before a gruff voice answered. "Mike Sullivan speaking," the voice said. Harold's throat felt dry. "Mike, it's Harold Matthews. Fox Company, Pacific Theater, 45. There was a moment of silence. Then the voice softened with recognition. "Harold. Harold Matthews. My God, it's been what? 20 years? Listen, Mike," Harold said quietly, watching through his window as another motorcycle roared past his house. "I need the network." The network was something veterans rarely talked about, but all knew existed. An unofficial system of support that connected military veterans across the country. Mike's voice turned serious. "Talk to me, brother." For the next 5 minutes, Harold explained everything. The bikers, the harassment, the destroyed flag. His voice cracked when he mentioned the flag, and Mike's sharp intake of breath told him his old friend understood the significance. "Give me 3 hours," Mike said firmly. "Just 3 hours, Harold. And keep your phone line clear." What happened next reminded Harold of the military operations he'd been part of so many years ago. Within 30 minutes, his phone started ringing. First came a call from Jack Peterson, a retired Marine living 2 towns over. Then Robert Chen, who had served in Vietnam. Then William Doc Thompson, a former Navy medic. Each call followed the same pattern. They asked for details, confirmed his address, and promised to spread the word. Harold sat by his phone, writing down names as they called. By noon, his notepad was filled with names of veterans from every branch of service: Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force. Some were from his era, others from Vietnam, and even a few young ones from more recent conflicts. Mrs. Rodriguez, watching from her window, saw Harold sitting by his phone all day. She noticed how he sat straighter with each call, how his shoulders seemed to lose their tired slump. She didn't know what was happening, but she could see the change in her old neighbor's demeanor. Around 2 p.m., a special call came in. The voice belonged to Colonel James Harper, now retired but still commanding respect. "Matthews," he said, My son's a police captain in the next county. He's bringing some of his officers, all veterans. They'll be off juvie, but they'll be there. Harold's eyes grew misty. Thank you, Colonel. No thanks needed, Marine. We take care of our own. The bikers remained oblivious to what was happening. They continued their usual harassment, riding past Harold's house, revving their engines, and shouting insults. Crusher even walked up to Harold's mailbox and deliberately knocked it sideways again, laughing as he walked away. By late afternoon, Harold had received over 50 calls. Each one represented not just one person, but entire networks of veterans. His small notebook was now full of names, times, and promises. The last call came from Mike Sullivan again. It's done, Mike said. Everything's in motion. Tomorrow morning, 900 hours. Be ready, brother. Harold looked at his wall of medals, then at the folded, torn flag on his coffee table. I'll be ready. That evening, the bikers threw another loud party at the warehouse. They were celebrating something, their music and laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Harold sat in his armchair, surprisingly calm. For the first time in weeks, he felt at peace. Tom Baker, his neighbor, noticed the lights were still on in Harold's house and walked over to check on him. Through the window, he saw the old veteran sitting calmly in his chair, a small smile on his face. Everything okay, Mr. Matthews? Tom called through the screen door. Harold turned, and Tom was struck by the look in the old veteran's eyes. It wasn't fear or resignation. It was the quiet confidence of a man who knew something others didn't. Everything's fine, Tom, Harold replied. But tomorrow might be interesting. As another motorcycle roared past the house, Harold didn't flinch. Instead, he checked his watch and made a small mark in his notebook. In less than 12 hours, the bikers would learn why the motto of the Marine Corps, Semper Fidelis, always faithful, wasn't just words. It was a promise, a bond that neither time nor distance could break. And that promise was about to be kept. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Harold was up earlier than usual, at 5:30 a.m., dressed in his pressed blue shirt and khaki pants. His medals, polished the night before, were pinned carefully to his shirt. The torn American flag lay folded with military precision on his coffee table. At 8:45 a.m., the bikers began their usual morning routine. Crusher and 5 others sat on their motorcycles in front of the warehouse, drinking coffee and occasionally revving their engines to disturb the Sunday morning peace. They pointed and laughed when they saw Harold standing on his porch wearing his medals. Look at Grandpa playing dress-up, one of them shouted, causing the others to laugh. Harold checked his watch, 8:55 a.m. He could hear something in the distance. A low rumble, like far-off thunder. The bikers heard it too, their laughter fading as they looked around in confusion. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the rumble became a roar. From both ends of the street, motorcycles appeared. Not in ones or twos, but in formation, 4 bikes wide, riding with military precision. The riders were a mix of ages, some with gray hair, others young and fit, but all sat with the unmistakable posture of military training. The first group was led by Mike Sullivan himself, now 71, on a spotless Harley-Davidson decorated with Marine Corps emblems. Behind him came row after row of motorcycles, each rider wearing a vest showing their military branch and years of service. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all were represented. From the other direction came another column, led by Police Captain Harper in civilian clothes, his off-duty motorcycle bearing military police insignia. With him rode dozens of police officers, firefighters, and emergency responders, all veterans, all in civilian gear, all with military patches on their riding vests. The bikers outside the warehouse stared in disbelief as over 300 motorcycles filled the street. The formation split smoothly, surrounding the warehouse in a perfect containment maneuver that spoke of military training. The roar of engines died to a low idle, then silence. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped onto her porch. Other neighbors emerged from their houses. Children pressed their faces against windows. Everyone watched in amazement as the veterans dismounted their bikes in perfect unison. Mike Sullivan, his Marine Corps vest displaying combat medals that matched Harold's, walked up to Harold's porch first. He snapped a crisp salute, which Harold returned with dignity. Fox Company, reporting as requested, sir, Mike said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Then, one by one, veterans began approaching Harold's porch. Each saluted and introduced themselves. 2nd Battalion, Vietnam, 68. Desert Storm, 91. Afghanistan, 2010. Iraq, 2003. The procession continued for several minutes. The bikers watched in stunned silence as hundreds of veterans paid their respects to Harold. Some were walking with canes, others had prosthetic limbs, but all moved with purpose and pride. Crusher and his gang found themselves surrounded by a sea of military patches, combat medals, and determined faces. Their 6 motorcycles looked small and insignificant compared to the hundreds of bikes that now lined the street. Captain Harper approached Crusher directly. His voice was calm, but carried the authority of both his police rank and military service. "I believe," he said, looking at the vandalized fence and the empty flagpole, "we need to have a discussion about respect." Harold stood on his porch, watching as veterans of 4 wars filled his street. Many carried folded flags under their arms. Tom Baker, who had never served himself, stood in his yard with tears in his eyes. His children waved small American flags that someone had handed them. The morning sun glinted off hundreds of military patches and medals. The air smelled of leather and motorcycle exhaust. But there was something else, a sense of brotherhood, of unity, of purpose. The bikers who had seemed so intimidating just yesterday now looked uncertain, their bravado evaporating in the face of real warriors. Harold Matthews stood straight and tall, his medals catching the morning light. He wasn't just one old veteran anymore. He was a symbol of everything these men and women had fought for: respect, dignity, and the right to live in peace. The gathering storm had arrived, and it wore military patches. The silence that fell over the street was heavy with tension. Captain Harper stood face to face with Crusher, while hundreds of veterans formed a respectful but unmistakably firm circle around the warehouse bikers. The contrast between the two groups couldn't have been more striking. Mike Sullivan stepped forward, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Let me introduce ourselves properly," he said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "I'm Sergeant Mike Sullivan, United States Marine Corps. Behind me are veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We're teachers, doctors, police officers, and business people now. But first, we're veterans." Crusher tried to maintain his tough appearance, but his voice shook slightly. "This is none of your business. This is between us and the old man." "That's where you're wrong, son," Mike replied. He gestured toward Harold, who stood dignified on his porch. "That old man is Harold Matthews, decorated combat veteran of World War II. He fought in 3 major Pacific battles. He'd earned the Purple Heart, pulling 2 fellow Marines to safety under heavy fire. When you disrespect him, you disrespect all of us." A tall veteran with a prosthetic leg stepped forward, carrying a folded American flag. "You know what this flag means to us?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Men and women died for this flag, friends of ours, brothers, sisters." He looked at the torn flag on Harold's coffee table, visible through the window. "And you treated it like trash." Crusher's gang members began to shift uncomfortably. The youngest among them, barely in his 20s, removed his skull-covered bandana and lowered his head. Captain Harper spoke next, his police badge glinting on his civilian clothes. "We're not here for violence. We're here for resolution. You have 2 choices. First, you can apologize, make amends, and learn to be respectful neighbors. Or second, you can leave. Either way, the harassment stops today." One of Crusher's gang members suddenly walked away from his group. He approached Harold's porch, removed his leather jacket, and spoke with a trembling voice. "My grandfather was in Vietnam," he said. "I never met him, but," he swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know. I didn't think." Harold descended his porch steps, each movement measured and dignified. He stood before the young biker, looking him in the eyes. "Apology accepted, son," he said quietly. Like a dam breaking, the moment changed everything. Another biker stepped forward, then another. Only Crusher remained defiant, but even he could see his gang dissolving before his eyes. Mike Sullivan approached Crusher one last time. "Your choice, son. Be part of the solution or be part of the problem. But remember, we veterans look after our own. Always have, always will. And Harold here. He's one of ours. Crusher looked around at the hundreds of faces watching him. He saw combat veterans young and old, their medals and patches telling stories of sacrifice he could barely imagine. He saw his own gang members removing their aggressive patches, looking ashamed. Finally, his shoulders slumped. I'll pay for the flag, he mumbled. And the fence. It's not about the money, Harold said, speaking up. His voice carried the weight of 93 years of experience. It's about respect. Not just for me, not just for veterans, but for your community, your neighbors, yourself. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming the gathering. From somewhere in the crowd, a veteran began singing the Marine Corps hymn. Others joined in, not just Marines, but Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard veterans, all honoring their brother in arms. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with trays of coffee. Children who had been watching from windows ventured out to look at the motorcycles. The atmosphere transformed from confrontation to commemoration. Tom Baker's youngest daughter walked up to Harold with a small American flag in her hands. "Mr. Matthews," she said shyly, "can I help you put up a new flag?" Harold smiled, tears in his eyes. He looked at the gathered veterans, the chastened bikers, and his neighbors all together in the street he'd called home for decades. "Yes," he said, taking the little girl's hand. "I think it's time for a new flag, and this time we'll raise it together." The message was clear. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't force, it's the unbreakable bond between those who have served and their commitment to protecting their own. 1 month had passed since the Sunday that changed everything on Cedar Street. The warehouse that once housed the troublesome biker gang now displayed a different sign: Veterans Community Center, all welcome. The transformation wasn't just in the building, it was in the entire neighborhood. Harold sat in his familiar porch swing, sipping his morning coffee, but he wasn't alone anymore. 2 young men who had once been part of Crusher's gang, Jason and Rick, were helping him repair his garden. They had traded their skull patches for American flag pins, and their leather jackets now bore the logo of the Veterans Motorcycle Club. "Mr. Matthews," Jason called out, holding up a rose bush, "is this where Mrs. Matthews used to plant the yellow ones?" Harold smiled, remembering Martha's love for yellow roses. "That's right, son. She always said they brought sunshine to the garden." The sound of motorcycles approached, but instead of causing fear, it brought smiles to people's faces. Mike Sullivan and a group of veterans pulled up, their bikes now a welcome sight in the neighborhood. They were bringing supplies for the community center's weekly gathering. Inside the transformed warehouse, what was once a space for loud parties had become something remarkable. One wall displayed military photos and medals, donated by local veterans. Another held a growing collection of American flags, each with its own story. The central area had tables where veterans gathered to share coffee, stories, and friendship. The youngest children in the neighborhood no longer hid from motorcycles. Instead, they gathered around veterans like Harold, listening to stories not of war, but of courage, friendship, and duty. Mrs. Rodriguez had resumed her Wednesday cookie deliveries, now making enough for the veterans' meetings, too. Tom Baker's daughter, Sarah, had started a school project about veterans in their community, inspired by Harold's story. The local newspaper had covered it, leading to more veterans finding their way to Cedar Street. Even the police, led by Captain Harper, had made the community center a regular stop on their patrols, not for trouble, but for coffee and conversation. Crusher had sold his motorcycle and moved away, but before leaving, he had done something unexpected. He'd left an envelope for Harold containing a handwritten apology, money for the damaged flag and fence, and a photo of his own grandfather in military uniform. Harold had framed the photo. It now hung in the community center as a reminder that change was always possible. The center hosted weekly meetings where veterans helped other veterans navigate everything from VA benefits to job applications. Young veterans found mentors, older veterans found purpose, and the neighborhood found a new heart. Harold's garden bloomed better than ever, tended now by many hands. Every morning, different veterans would stop by to help with the weeding or just to share a cup of coffee on his porch. His stories, once shared with just a few neighborhood kids, now inspired a new generation to understand the true meaning of service and respect. On this particular morning, Harold watched as Jason and Rick carefully planted the last of the yellow roses. The American flag above his porch, one of many gifted by the veterans, caught the morning breeze. Mrs. Rodriguez walked over with a fresh batch of cookies, followed by Tom Baker and his children. You know, Harold said to the small gathering, Martha would have loved this. She always said a garden grows better when it's tended by friends. Mike Sullivan, who had become a regular visitor, nodded in agreement. And a community grows stronger when it's built on respect. The sound of more motorcycles in the distance signaled the arrival of more veterans for the day's activities. But now, every rumble of an engine reminded the neighborhood not of fear, but of the bonds that had grown between them all. Harold looked at his Purple Heart medal, still displayed proudly on his wall. Next to it hung a new photograph, showing him surrounded by hundreds of veterans on that transformative Sunday morning. Below it was a simple plaque that read, "Never too old to stand up, never too late to make a difference." As he watched the morning sun rise over his renewed neighborhood, Harold Matthews, 93 years young, understood that sometimes life's greatest victories don't come from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into friends. His final call hadn't just saved his home, it had created something far more precious, a community where respect, understanding, and brotherhood flourished, proving that even the darkest situations could lead to the brightest of futures.